This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Robin Means Coleman, professor of media studies and of African American and African studies at the University of Virginia, where she is also director of the Black Fantastic Media Research Lab. In addition to a number of scholarly and popular essays, she is the author of Horror Noire, a history of Black American horror from the 1890s to the present, published as a second edition in 2023, and African American Viewers in the Black Situation Comedy, Situating Racial Humor, published in 2000. She is co-author of The Black Guy Dies First, Black Horror from Fodder to Oscar, 2023, and Intercultural Communication for Everyday Life from 2014. She is the editor of Say It Loud, African American Audiences, Media, and Identity from 2002, and co-editor of both the Oxford Handbook of Black Horror Film from 2024 and Fight the Power, the Spike Lee Reader from 2008. In this conversation, we discuss the dynamic character of Black studies in relation to community-campus relations, the political nature of research and teaching, and the complex relationship between Black studies and study focused on Black topics. Hello, Robin. How are you today?
What's up, John?
Well, welcome to Black Studies Podcast. This is a great part of my day. I had a very stressful morning, very busy morning. I was really looking forward to this conversation. Generally, my mood today, I'm very happy to be here and change the trajectory of my stress. But I was really excited that we found a time to talk on this podcast. I really love your work. I think it's the kind of stuff that impacts the field of Black studies in such interesting and important ways, doing cultural studies, working with various kinds of materials, and bringing so many different kinds of sensibilities to them. So I'm really happy that you made the time, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So thank you for it.
Oh, thank you for having me. This should be fun.
Well, let me start before we get into sort of how you think about the field of Black studies and situate your work within it and these sorts of questions. I wanted to start really with a more personal question and ask you, if you would, to sort of narrate how you came to the study of Black life. You know, what drew you to the study of Black life, to Black studies, and what sustained you in relation to both?
Interesting. That's a really fascinating question that I have, of the millions of questions I've been asked, no one has ever asked me that. And so typically when I start these interviews around horror, they're like, how did you get into horror? And, what was your childhood like? So I love this question.
What was your childhood like? I like that as a horror question, start question.
Like, what happened to you? Where were your parents? I love this as a question. And I think, part of it is obviously I'm a Black woman, and so I'm studying the world and environments around me, but I don't think that's fully sufficient, because there's lots of sort of ways that you can go with that work. But there is something that is interesting to me about, in particular, as also a media studies scholar, the union, the sort of meeting of Blackness, a Black aesthetic, and sort of how that is mediated, how people come to make meaning of Blackness. And there is something that is also interesting about exploring how Black people make meaning of Blackness. And I want to give a shout out to the late James Jackson, who directed ISR at the University of Michigan. I happened to work at Michigan. He happened to hire me when I was starting at Michigan those so many years ago. But before that, I'd read an essay that he wrote, where he talked about the importance of studying Black people. And he also talked about that we need not do that in a comparative way, because there was sufficient and significant diversity within Blackness. And when I say that I loved that he wrote that in particular, and I think that really helped me because up until that moment when I had something to hold in my hand as a student and say, see, this brilliant person is saying this, there was a real push, an insistence that the questions that I was asking be comparative across race. So
Hmm.
this is what Black people, you're interested in what Black people are saying, but what about white people? And that was always the impulse. And so James
Mhm.
helped with that. So I hope that answers your question. That's sort of what the interest was, why I do the kind of work that I do, where I look at Blackness deep rather than sort of across. And that's what gets
Mhm.
me excited.
I like that way of putting it, blackness deep rather than blackness across. I mean, it reminds me, and now that I don't work there, it's time to safely mention it. But I remember having a conversation with a faculty member in a different department when I was at my previous position, and he was like, "You have no diversity in your
Mm,
classrooms or in your
mhm,
material because it's Black Studies." And I was
uh-huh.
like, well, you should actually enter these classrooms. You should actually enter this material.
Yes,
The diversity is so massive. I mean,
that's right.
just to begin, there are multiple genders in the classroom. There are
That's right,
multiple
right.
classes. There are multiple
Yes.
nations, and there are
Geography. Yes,
multiple,
yes.
multiple, as you said, aesthetics. And
Yes,
that aesthetic dimension is not just a taste question; it's also
that's right.
formative of so many things.
That's right.
What do you? I mean, I'm curious what sort of drew you to the aesthetic question around Blackness and Black experience.
Yeah, another really terrific question that I hadn't thought about fully, but as a communication scholar, there's such an emphasis that's put on what's languageable. And that
Mm.
languageableness is often right because we have rhetoric departments in comm as well as in English. But the rhetoricians kind of loomed large in my training. And it was really very much about, sort of what was written, what was speakable, what was talked about, the written record. You hear that a lot in debates about archives from historians to librarians about what counts or what is sort of evidence of the kinds of things that are communicated. And I knew that from a very, very young age, that there was something about Blackness from style, from art, from the ways that we speak, the nonverbal communication, that there was all of these what I call cultural echoes, right? These cultural echoes where everybody kinda understood, you didn't have to explain it, and the way that I talk about it is the difference between the TV series Rock and the TV series Blackish. The
Hmm.
sitcom Rock, they had, sort of Black humor, Black aesthetic, and never once did they sort of explain the language, the joke, the thing that was happening in their community, which was Baltimore. Versus Blackish, where they literally start with like a title card that says, here's our Black term for the day and here's the definition. That's
Yeah.
what I'm talking about. I was more interested in kind of how does something like Rock happen? How do they write this? Um, these actors in this room full of writers around Black life, culture, history, and humor, and we all get it no matter where we're situated, um, versus one like a Blackish where they're teaching us. They're teaching us and
Hmm.
everybody else Blackness. So I think that that was what was interesting to me. Not just what was languageable, but those cultural echoes that everybody seems to pick up on. I wanted to know more about that.
I love that. Already, I mean, the deep, not across, echo, and just rock. I mean, they putting rock back out into the conversation in cultural studies. I is already worth our time. We are 8 minutes in, so yeah, no, that's I love that. So thank you. I think that really that gives the depth as you're talking about that depth to that question of of how you're thinking about Blackness. And echoes, of course, are about depth, right? They're about depth and space, but also the proximity of all of that. So, well, let me then shift a little bit, and we'll come back to talking about your work, but start again with a question of how you think about Black studies. And I'm thinking about Black studies in its origin, 50-something years ago, which really has a sort of tension at its origin between the founding of Black studies through the demand that the Black intellectual tradition have a place in college campuses and in what it means to study. And so that was something that the disciplines weren't doing. You know, you couldn't study Black life in any sustained way in any, history department, sociology department, et cetera. And so Black studies is demanded in 1969, 1970, and after as a space for that intellectual tradition to study, to expand, and so forth. But it was also that time of radical Black liberation struggle that was rethinking the relationship between study and politics of campuses and communities. And that political imperative to correct and to come up with prescriptions, right, is also part of the origin story of Black studies. We're 50-something years later. Those are still two things that we think a lot about in the field and cognate fields. And so I'm interested in hearing how you in 2024 think about Black studies, but also how you think about Black studies in relationship to this conflicted origin story.
Yes. Oh, now this question I really appreciate, and I may take the answer up in a way that people typically don't. And I'm going to put on my previous administrative hat, right? And so until very recently, I had all of these titles: vice president, associate provost, chief diversity officer, all of these things. And so I was on the president's cabinet. And it's interesting at two different institutions, at Texas A&M and then at Northwestern University. And it was interesting to be on, these presidents' cabinets during everything from kind of George Floyd to Israel-Palestine, right? And so what you're seeing, what I have this front row seat to and am advising on is, sort of how to support our students, faculty, and staff. They're thinking about, how do I manage a campus? And the management part of that is, sort of interesting. What is at risk? What's at stake? There's a lot of voices in these presidents' ears, from board members to parents to the campus community, the external community. So you've got to sift through all of that. And one of the things that I talked about in these meetings was when you started to see the nation, presidents across the U.S., make a turn toward not issuing statements, right? Speaking to the crises that were happening on college campuses in America, where they were retreating from that, I leaned back into, well, wait a minute, right? I have always been jointly appointed in variously titled Africana Studies, African American and African Studies, Black Studies, whatever it was called. At Michigan, it was Afro-American and African Studies. And that's exactly our origin story. There is exactly the opposite. And in fact, because these units come out of a particular set of political movements that is so deeply interdisciplinary, to be silent at the sort of uppermost parts of our institution is absolutely the opposite of what we would ever say is okay. And so there was a concern that in saying we won't take positions, we won't offer these position statements, that would in effect silence the studies units, like a Black studies unit, a women's studies unit, an American studies unit. This is what we do. And so I talked a little bit about that with these presidents and said, first, if you want to not weigh in, that's you. It's a personal decision, but it can't be an institutional decision for us, because that's exactly what our mission and our core values are. But the second issue there is something I felt strongly about is that I think our presidents, these university presidents, should be looking to Black studies as a way to say, wait, what are the core values of an American university or college at this time? And it is not to be silent. It is actually to step up. And it doesn't mean that you have to take a position statement, but what we don't do is abdicate our central mission, which is pedagogical. And so if we are seeing today a crisis in higher education around a mistrust of what we're doing on our campuses, it is precisely because these institutions have failed to pay attention to and learn the lessons from our Black Studies units, and they don't say, wait a minute, we are exactly the people that our publics need to be hearing from, in the same way that the Black Studies origin story is a story of culture, community, and campuses coming together that together really shifted our national understanding of Black life, of Blackness. But our presidents aren't doing that. So my feeling, I don't even know if I'm answering the question at this point, John, but this is
No,
what I
you
felt
really
like
are,
I
actually.
needed to say, is that there is a value to pay attention to that history. And it's not a set aside, it is core to what our institution's work is. And I think it's a mistake for our presidents not to be paying attention to that, particularly given the strength of the interdisciplinary nature of these units, and how they are, we have everything from, folks from the health sciences to political science to media studies to anthropology to history. They're all there. And we have figured out a way to come together in this really fantastic interdisciplinary way to say, from each of our kind of disciplinary mountaintops, we can come together and have a conversation and engage in debate about what's happening in this country. We are the best at it, and they should be looking to us.
No, I mean, it speaks directly to the question. I'm glad you took it in that direction, because I think that this kind of perspective, thinking about it not simply as, as an imagination of the origins, but as you say, as something we're actually practicing or not practicing in the contemporary moment. Because the idea of political crisis that connects communities and campuses, right, but also the work of our intellectual life, I'm not sure what education looks like without that. I think there's a lot of fantasies that somehow we enter a space where that's not happening. I don't quite know what that is, but it would be an education that doesn't seem to be connected to much.
Yes. And we've just given that up. We've handed it over. We've just thrown our hands up and said, and I get it. I get that leaders, it's easier for leaders, right, to just not say anything. But that isn't our work. That's not what we do on college campuses. That is not pedagogy. And we all know that pedagogy is activism.
Robin Means Coleman for president of the universities. I like this. I'm sure you're not working hard enough. Why not just take over this? I mean, those are thankless positions, but they're also positions that often, I think, make themselves thankless by, as you just articulated so well, not actually taking seriously what we do on a daily basis and have done for centuries, but for us, decades at this point, too. Well, let me shift a little bit and ask you about your own work in relation to Black studies. You work in film and media studies, popular cultural studies, obviously, as you've already mentioned as well, communication theory and practice. And I think this combination, I mean, it's in your written work, there's just so many potent insights for the field of Black studies. So I'm curious to sort of ask you how you think about your own work in relation to the field. Both, where do you see it in relation to the history of Black studies? How do you think it fits in that history of the field? But also, what new horizons do you think it opens up?
So, as you said, to be clear, I'm trained in, it's been variously called, it was communication, mass communication, communication studies, media studies, right? So that is my disciplinary training. And at the same time, after sort of getting the PhD, there was never a moment where I said, I'm good with just being in communication studies. I always wanted to be jointly appointed. And certainly that has to do with working at a PWI, a predominantly white institution, where these departments are home. But more importantly, in going through my college education, and, at that time, there was it was Temple, and that was the only place you could get a Black Studies degree, and there wasn't any other place, right? So people were paying attention, ooh, Temple, something's going on there. And so at best, coming through, right in the 80s, maybe you were lucky to land at an institution where you could get a minor, right?
Mm-hmm.
But an African American studies department. I mean, we're still celebrating spaces at our universities where they're getting department status, right? Or they're fighting for department status, or they finally get a graduate program, and that's in 2024. So it was really important to be jointly appointed, but that doesn't mean that one is trained in Black studies. And what's really important, and I take the lessons from media studies and apply it to this. Just because people write about Black people does not make them Black studies scholars. It makes them people who are using Black folks as kind of the object of study. The difference in what I try to uphold in my own scholarship is then you turn to the theories, the methods, the scholarship from within Black studies, and that guides your work. And so I'm pretty prickly about those two things, right? The training, when we talk about being trained, we're talking about being trained in a literature. And I'm slowly making my way through a recent conversation that was a podcast about, is there a Black studies canon? To be able to enter into that debate means first that you read a lot of that stuff and you can weigh in and say what should or shouldn't be. Should we be talking about canons? Folks who are not Black studies scholars are not sort of prepared yet for that conversation. So again, just because you kind of have Black people or Black text as your object of study does not automatically, in my view, make you a Black studies scholar. What does make you a Black studies scholar is your attention to and integration of those theories, methods, concepts into your own scholarly work. I think that's the most important.
Yeah, I mean, this gets very, very intimate into my workplace, where we have these kind of conversations all the time about thinking about what is it that makes us Black studies scholars, but also what makes us a Black studies department. And that difference between working on Black topics and working in the Black studies tradition is huge. I mean, I think every one of us has a different kind of story about our relationship to that. I not that this is a podcast about me, but when I decided to shift fields back in 98, which apparently was a long time ago, seems really recent to me, but it was a 10-year reading project.
Yes.
That really was, I had done undergraduate in a great books program. So I was like, this is how you learn traditions. You read from the beginning to the contemporary. But I think, for me, this sort of 50 years, I mean, it's a neat number for years, right? But it is this crossroads of how is Black studies a tradition and something unto itself, and how is it just a collection of people working on Black topics? And that dispute is, for me, really and a really important conversation, but it's a really tough conversation because it's the kind of conversation that disciplines typically don't have, right? Because they have sort of so much more settled boundaries.
That's right.
I mean, how do you think about your own work as Black studies work?
And the thing is, what's interesting is I do study genre, and a lot of what I talk about is disrupting boundaries, blowing those boundaries up. So I get that. And I am all for as many people as possible studying, Black people and Blackness. I appreciate that. And I also think that welcoming in people who study Black folks into a Black studies department, I think clearly we change, right? We evolve from that sort of second generation of education by being together, rubbing shoulders, and now talking about Blackness centrally versus as just sort of an object in the way we would in our sort of other core discipline. But so being in a Black space and talking about Black people in that way kind of shifts our axis of orientation, and I enjoy that. My own work, it's really been an interesting tension, and sometimes I feel like I'm getting it right in the way that I want to based on external sort of my colleagues' reactions, right? So in talking about, I'll give you an example. The Bible, my quote unquote Bible that I carry around is Richard Eiten's In Search of the Black Fantastic. I love this book. I think it is fabulous. And it's one of the few books where I'm looking at it now. I have multiple copies because I've marked up one version so much that I needed one at home and one in my office and what, like all of this. And heaven forbid, I move or I travel and I leave it somewhere. So I really love this book. And he's talking about Black popular culture. He's talking about Black possibilities. And it's an extraordinary work. And Richard was not a media studies scholar. And it's those kinds of scholars that really deeply inform my work and my thinking. I was going to name drop some other folks, but I would just simply say that, and they come out of Black studies. For me, then what became a challenge is I was getting feedback from, like my department chairs who were saying, is this film studies? Is this media studies? What is this? And it is true. There are pieces or presentations where every single person cited was likely in or connected to a Black studies program. And that became sort of a cool movement later, in the 21st century, where it was like cite women, cite Black folks. That kind of just happened intuitively in doing some of this scholarship where you're citing Black folks, right? You're citing those who are studying Black people and Black culture. And I think some of the media studies people were like, huh? So I think that question was a good one, and I'm good with it.
Yeah, I mean, Ashley, my collaborator, and I, one of the things that we're going to do as a sort of development of this podcast series is start to have topical podcasts. And one of the podcast topics is going to be, what is an exemplary Black studies text? And that's such a great example of one and I think it's one of these questions that rather than the canon formation question, canons and counter canons, which I find really interesting, but the sort of exemplary texts, I think, really reveal like what connects to Black studies as a field, and what is like an important text that helps Black studies, but isn't a Black studies text as such. And these are not judgments, about one's good, one's bad, but really for me, it's like this window into the field. And I think, Eiten's book, I mean, that's a great example, I think, of a really exemplary Black studies text. Yeah.
I think it is. And I love that there may be, I doubt there's robust debate around that particular book, but I do like the conversation, right? The debate about what does it mean, to point to some of these texts as sort of exemplary texts. I enjoy that. I am always, I'll just say as an asterisk next to this, a little bit nervous when that translates into inclusion and exclusion.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's why I would love, that's why I like debates around the exemplary texts where, I love this, but, what does it mean for this? But, maybe we'll have you
That's what's great about what
this.
UVA is doing with the Woodson Institute, because it's now bringing these folks, these pre-doc and post-doc fellows in to an African American and African studies space. And you can see, I mean, really in a very short few months, the proposals that these, brilliant rising scholars are offering, and just being in the space and rubbing shoulders and having conversations with faculty, how their thinking, how their scholarship is evolving in this way, informed by Black studies. It is amazing to watch, and I wish I had it when I was a student.
And I love that you'd also mentioned a similar thing before about just being around each other in a Black Studies department is so formative of what Black Studies is or how we become
Yes.
connected to it. I mean, if someone were to ask me, like, how did you become a Black Studies scholar? I could talk about this reading list and how I came to it
Right.
with working with a librarian. But what would go alongside that as every bit as important is sharing an office with the late Jeff Ferguson, rest in peace, for 10 years.
Yes.
And, he and I just sitting there, chit-chatting, sometimes fun, sometimes arguing, being playful, whatever, exchanging books, just looking at books.
Yes.
That the rubbing shoulders, talking to each other. And just that's a whole different kind of experience, in my experience, than disciplinary departments, which
That's right.
I think there's not as much urgency around, we're together and this is gonna mean something, right, in terms of the very name of what we do.
Exactly.
And let me pick up then on this, and the Woodson Center, maybe is a place to sort of locate this, but also, as you've already talked about your past workplaces. I'm interested in how, your PhD being in a discipline in communication, but then spending all this time in area studies, how you think that movement back and forth, because I imagine it's always a movement back and forth between, disciplinary training and then multidisciplinary or area studies departments, how that's impacted your scholarship, but also just as much how it impacts how you approach a classroom.
So that's interesting. I mean, have I felt like, so I'm not disputing, I just haven't given this thought, right? Does it feel like a movement back and forth? What I feel like is that it's right. And what do I mean by that? That my scholarship, there was something that I was trying to do in media studies and communication studies, and it was incomplete. So it wasn't the moving back and forth as much as it felt like a limitation. Until
I like that.
Yeah, right. Until I start to, not just as a faculty member, but until I start taking classes, in variously titled departments like Africana Studies, and understand that, like, what that meant for someone to opt in when I'm a student, to take these classes. It sometimes meant cross-enrolling, like cross-registering at another university that I have to get on a bus in the middle of the day and go travel to, right? To take a class and then get on a bus and come back. So there's, sort of where which I love my discipline, right? Takes me, but it wasn't far enough for what my research questions are. So I think that that's important. It doesn't feel like a back and forth. It felt like that there's still, I think it's interesting that there's all of these sort of joint appointments in Black Studies departments where we kind of have, we often talk about, like, I'm 49%, 49% here, 51%. And we have to have a core department. And very often the core department is our disciplinary home. I'm in political science, but I'm jointly appointed in Africana. And my home department is poli-sci or whatever that is. I think that that's interesting. And I also think it's interesting and important for at some point for that to happen in the reverse as well. I do want to see these folks who are jointly appointed. I want to see that in communication or media studies. Because it happens in one direction, but not in the other. I think our departments, our disciplines would be better and richer for it. And certainly that's a benefit. I know people are sort of you know, grappling with what are the boundaries of Black studies and where people are trained. But I think our interdisciplinarity makes us better for it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's the nature of those joint appointments and where our root appointment is. I think, and you said 51-49%, that is my percentage.
Is it?
That 2% carries so much weight, though. I'm 51% in African American and Africana studies. That means that's all my committees, and they have to handle all my paperwork and all of that. So it's a big 2%.
So you have to explain that for some listeners who aren't at institutions like ours. It's also kind of a structural issue, right? That the university says there are some universities where you can't be 50-50. You have to pick, and that has to be represented in your fraction. And so, there's all of that, and not everybody has that or understands that. So I just wanted to put a pin on that and say, this is why you come up with these percentages where institutions, whether it's like Workday and the HR system can't handle it, or there's a historical or a history from the institution where you have to have a home department. Typically, it's around going up for tenure and promotion, and they say, which is your lead department? And that's represented in a fraction. But then that means something. That isn't just an administrative thing that you deal with. It also is an identity.
Absolutely. I'm a little mad that you said the word Workday. I have to do Workday training when we get done, but I have a couple of more modules we're converting to Workday. But no, but more seriously, that where we find our root. I mean, it ends up being because as you were saying before. I mean, who we spend our time with in our hallways and in our meetings. Who we rub shoulders with is so formative for who and what we are as writers and teachers over years. And so that home department question ends up having a real weight as well. And I think when a discipline is the root department and you're in an area study, also, I think that area study suffers because you don't spend as much time there. I mean, silly to say, but being face-to-face matters.
It does. And I would take those hallway conversations, those office conversations seriously. I don't think that they're, sort of just an add-on or something that is, just sort of an informal community building. We do talk about oral histories. We do talk about, who are our griots versus our mentors and all of these things. That is a part of what makes Black studies also what it is. And what happens in those conversations, it's as we were talking about earlier, conversations about hiring and debates about what are the needs of the discipline today versus tomorrow, setting a Black studies agenda. And it isn't just our institutions. We know that, like UNC Chapel Hill has just come online with a graduate program. We are paying attention. All of our institutions are paying attention to when another graduate program comes online. How are they training? What are their emphases? Because that impacts, it informs our hiring, it informs the discipline. Those are the conversations, those are the hallway conversations and meeting conversations that we have. And those are formal and those are important. They inform our policies, our structures, our guidelines around the discipline. So I just don't want people to think, oh, you're just hanging out. And no, we are pinky in the brain and we are plotting the future.
Absolutely. On good days and bad days. Absolutely. Let me ask you a big question about the past of the field, and ask you, what do you think Black Studies has done well? But also, what do you think Black Studies has not done particularly well?
Oh, well, I feel like everything about this conversation, clearly I'm a fan, it has done well. So I know that there are some challenges, right? It doesn't mean that they're not doing things, we aren't doing things well, but there are challenges. And I think that those challenges are, again, with an administrative hat on, it's about enrollments. It's about majors. The sort of students love to minor in Black studies. They love to come over to the space where we build community. They look to Black studies faculty for mentoring and, all of these things. And translating that into something that administrators understand, that makes it legible to them, I think we continue to struggle with that. So on any given day, there can be, just I'm thinking now about my time at Michigan, right, in Afro American and African studies, where there were students just everywhere, just coming through all the time, and doors were always open. This is before COVID too, right? That we needed like lounges for students, and it was a place of community. But then you would get a form to fill out that says, like, how many majors do you have? And that number may be lower than, a unit of equivalent size, but certainly a longer history as well, because again, these are relatively new units. And folks didn't understand if they didn't come into the space. So I think that our challenge is that we are popular in a way that doesn't match the metrics that our institutions, like they're asking the wrong questions of some of these departments. So I think that that's the sort of blessing and curse of these units.
Yeah, how to communicate that in a way that makes administrative action. If you can solve that problem, that would be fantastic. We have that a lot, being indispensable, but not having the right kind of numbers.
Exactly. That's right. I love that. And say that again, being indispensable, but also not having the right kind of numbers for, like course enrollment. Like, oh, we want 15 people enrolled in each course and you've got 8. So those kinds of conversations. That's not the Black Studies tradition. Those are the wrong questions for our discipline. But here we are.
Yes. Let me ask a future-oriented question. Thinking about what would be an index of the success of Black studies in the future is beyond our lifetimes, unless we have some extension into another 100 years of life. But nevertheless, imagining the future of Black studies, what would be its ultimate success? Would it be to have continued the work that I think has been one real success of Black studies of transforming disciplines, so that most disciplines at this point have Black life as a significant part, if not a central part of what they do, right? History and English, I think, are really prominent this way. It's a transformation of the disciplines into places where the study of Black life is absolutely central. Would that be the success of Black studies? Or is the future success of Black studies to really have fully articulated itself to be its own thing, a thing that can't actually be reabsorbed or digested by disciplines? And are we there, or what, should we be moving in that direction? Because it strikes me as there is something distinctive about Black studies, but also we've had such an impact on the disciplines. That was part of the origin story of like transforming the disciplines that wouldn't transform themselves. What would be that sign of our ultimate success in the future?
So this is another tough question, and it's sort of interesting because, again, I get invited to do a lot of like program reviews or college reviews or something like that. And it's 2024, and I would say we are not there yet with our disciplines representing Blackness in the way that they should. I mean, I still have written, and in fact, it's October of 2024, this very year, I've written the sentence where I say, you still shouldn't be doing like Black Day on your syllabi. Like that's not what
Black
this
Day,
is.
yes.
And we are still seeing that across the country at some of our, sort of the best R1s out there, that you are still seeing that happen. We are still seeing entire disciplines that have zero diverse or departments. I'm sorry. We are seeing entire departments that have zero people of color on their faculty, right? And certainly not Black faculty or faculty who are connected to Black studies in any way. That's still happening. And we're holding our breath based on when we're talking and taping this. We don't know the outcome of the election yet. And that either could get significantly worse. And no matter who's elected, it may still get significantly worse given what's happening in higher ed around what we're generally calling the attack on DEI. So before we talk about what does a success look like, we've got to pay attention to some really big threats to the hiring of faculty, the recruitment of students, to even if we survive this, the preparation that our students are bringing. It isn't just that, everybody's like, oh, my students aren't reading. They're not only may they not be reading, but they're certainly not allowed to read or be exposed to a wealth, a huge, and it's Black studies that's under attack, right? Students are not allowed to read our books in junior high and high school. That is the thing that worries me. So getting to a point where, many of our relevant disciplines are now more inclusive about our scholarship and training others in that way. I wish that was the only thing that I could, sort of focus on at this time. Yeah. But today, we have endured so many setbacks that I am worried for the discipline itself. This is a marathon battle that we are facing now.
I mean, part of what motivates this question, or where Ashley and I came to this question as part of this podcast series, is, at the end of this Richard Wright essay on, I think it's called Negro American Literature, character of Negro American literature, and he says, well, African American literature will stop writing about race when white people stop beleaguering Black people. And, knowing Richard Wright, that's a little tongue in cheek. It's like, we can't really see that happening, can we? But for me, it sort of raised this question of like, is Black studies something that survives, the disciplines becoming what everybody kind of needed them and wanted them to be at the origins of Black studies? But I like your response. It's like, what is the timing of this question? And what does it mean to ask this question and see what a bleak world opens up, right? In terms of, we're worried about closing in, in the worst way rather than closing in the hypothetically best way.
Yeah. I mean, you tell me, are you also feeling this? Do you have, I don't want to be alarmist, but are you feeling those concerns as well, that we really have to pay attention to kind of two different things that's happening out there, and one of them is an attack on our very existence?
I mean, honestly, and I don't think I'm being paranoid, I've looked at that 49% in the English department and wondered if a Trump presidency would mean that would need to be 100%. Like, the agenda is not, I don't think it's paranoid to say that this department is one of the things that's not supposed to exist under that regime.
Right.
I'm also in Maryland. And so I feel like, well, this is a last holdout against that. But, fascism moves very quickly. And so if the question is, do I feel like it's under siege? Certainly not in terms of departmental rhetoric, but or state-based rhetoric or university president rhetoric. But I feel like it would be so naive for me to not imagine that I'm also a part of a nation that overwhelms those things that seem bubbly and protective.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's right.
I don't want to be right about that, by the way. I want to be paranoid, but I just don't think there's any way for it to be.
Actually, no. I mean, so it's not paranoia. We've read Project 2025, right? There's no...
Yeah.
When people tell you who and what they are, you should believe them, and it doesn't mean that that's going to go away, right? So, paranoia, no. My favorite word people know is providence, and people often think of it in sort of a spiritual sense, but it's my favorite definition is timely preparation for future potentialities, providence. Um,
There you
and
go. I like that.
this is the moment where, and we may be a little too late, it's October, but now is the moment for timely preparation for what we know are the future potentialities.
Yeah. So maybe this is already an answer to the last question I wanted to ask you, which is, what is the thing in Black studies that you think we should all be thinking about? The question we should all be asking?
Ooh. Is this, oh, this, you said that there will be moments where I pause. And we will not edit those out. Listen, they can only hear me. If they could see me, they could, like, my brain is like grinding, like trying to think of what should we. So here's how today I would answer this is um that I hope the struggle for me to answer this question reflects exactly what Black Studies is, the dynamic nature of the discipline, that it isn't about asking a question, but it is about asking a series of questions at the intersections. I'm not assuming that everybody is, sort of jointly trained. There are folks who, and a lot of folks who have PhDs in Black studies, but from each of our perches and our areas of interest and expertise are asking important questions to further shed light on, the Black experience, right? Not just Black people as objects, but as whole and full and realized subjects. And that's everything from, I just was doing an evaluation of someone who studies health disparities. And then I was doing an evaluation of someone else who was looking at Baldwin's time in Turkey, to the stuff that I do around social justice and media and the ways in which Black people use or move through certain genres to speak to social justice. All of those questions, I think, are important and should be on the table.
I love that. Thank you. I mean, look, this conversation has been fantastic. You've given us a lot to think about, not only about the big ideas in Black studies, but the big ideas and the real marrow of thinking about Black life, but also care for our institutions and our institutional spaces. I really appreciate that. It feels like we've been talking for a couple of hours because you've really touched on so many things that are really vital to what we do. And I really thank you for that. I appreciate your time, but your thoughtfulness in this is really, I'm just real grateful for it. So thank you for that, Robin.
Thank you for having me, John. It was a terrific conversation, and I've learned so much from you as well that I certainly will continue to sort of think about, study over, and ponder, for the days to come. We've had a really good conversation that folks heard and a little bit of the pre-conversation that folks didn't hear. This was terrific.
Yes. All right. Well, hopefully we'll have you back on to talk about exemplary this or that, or the non-exemplary this or that. But for now, again, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
You too.